Well, I went to Adelaide High School after I'd got my certificate, and I um, I was put into the A or B class. You did German or you did French, and I said I wanted to do art, and they said you can't do that till your third year. And I said right, and so I said to my mother that, told my mother that, and she said she found me this other school called Goodwood Technical High School, where they had an art teacher, and so that was 1942, and so I went there, and of course the art teacher was Jeffrey Smart. So that's how I met him, and he was he was a pleasantly imposing man. He was, he was in control, and he was a genial person, and a very, very good teacher, class teacher. The kids loved him, and they played a lot of games with him, but he was tolerant of that. He always had a great sense of humour and a twist of phrase. So, so I was just a kid in the class once a week when we did art, and he would take all the class out to paint landscapes and such. But the important thing was that he introduced us to the great art. He had a major book, Masterpieces of World Art. I think it was published in America. I got a copy later in my life. But all the great artists were there, and all the great images, and people you'd never heard of. No Australian artist, of course, all Titian, etc. Piero della Francesca, of course. And so he would hold these up, and of course the naked Sheilas, the kids used to go, oh, but he handled that with aplomb. He was so amusing. And after about, he must have picked up that I had I was terribly interested. I just drew all the time. And he must have picked up on this, because he invited me to come back after school and draw one. He used to get one of the students, and he'd do a head portrait drawing after school once a week, or maybe twice a week. But anyway, in my second year, he invited me to come back and draw with him, which was, it was both stressful. I'd never drawn from a figure, from a head, but at the same time, exciting, very exciting to be able to sit down next to him and see how he, blocked it in and put the lines in, and said to me, now, Brian, across there, that's the middle of the eye. You do it an oval, and there's the middle, and this, and I thought, wow, So that's how I learnt those little things, and I would draw with him, and that's about it. So that went on for a couple of years, till I left, or till I finished my course, and so that's the way we went. But at that time, he was exhibiting. He was quite a professional artist. Well, he was aiming to be a professional artist, put it that way, and he was able to. I think he'd been to the art school, and he'd met other artists there, Jacqueline Hick. Do you know her work? And very much a South Australian artist, but a very talented woman. They became great friends, and so. He was mixing in the art circle, and also the art circle at that time, there was a split with the Royal South Australian Society of Arts and the Contemporary Art Society, which emanated originally from Melbourne. That started to develop in Adelaide, and I got involved with that because, when you're a painter that wasn't painting in the Hans Huyssen tradition, then you needed the Contemporary Art Society if you were going to exhibit. But there were only two places you could exhibit in Adelaide at that time publicly, was at the Royal South Australian Society of Arts. Wonderful old Victorian building, beautiful gallery, excellent light. So they used to have a spring show and an autumn show, and a jury would check you out and have a painting included, or one or two if you were fortunate. And so I sold a couple of paintings from there, but after I left school. But I did exhibit. I was selected before I left school, but Jeff was always in those shows. And But he didn't seem to get involved with the Contemporary Art Society, to my knowledge. He was, you know, abstraction was the thing, and Sid Nolan and Arthur Boyd were the sort of painters, and they were rather gestural, and they painted symbolically, or they chose symbols, like Ned Kelly, for example. Whereas Jeff was rather a classicist. He was very much. I think what always reminds me is Robert Hughes. Robert Hughes refers to an element of painting. He calls it slow painting. Do you know of that? Well, it's in essence it's painting that has a sense of permanence, but also a sense that when you look at it, there's a lot you can read from it, and it's invariably realism. Well, not photographic realism, but just of the object, of the subject. And Geoffrey was always of that. But I think surrealism also captured his interest. Thus you got in his work at that time, I remember some of the paintings he was doing, there was often a building or some aspect that had a highlight on it, like you get in surrealist paintings. Well, it was formal, and his pictures were very well organised in the classical sense of the golden mean, and particular motifs were set in particular positions. He was very careful about the planning of his compositions, and they don't look like it, but they are very well planned, and that's why they don't look like it. They're beautifully conceptualised. But they take a lot of time, and he'd take a lot of time to get them right. And I remember seeing in the studio once, he was painting a picture from Port Elliot of it was a pram in the foreground and somebody sitting on a seat, and an old, you know, a Norfolk Island pine, and a little a small kiosk, and beautifully arranged. And I recall as a kid, I was only 12 or 13, I was 14 or 15, I recall that they were just, that was really very influential to me, because that's what I like too, to get things formally done. And he used to jokingly say, "Oh, you'll be a very good abstractionist, Brian." And I said, "Why?" "Well, you're just a natural at organising." So I picked up on that and recognised that he saw that in me, and which I was surprised. But that's part of the reason I also saw it in him, because he just planned things so beautifully. But getting back to the class, he was always interesting about the arts, and that's what was remarkable. Coming from an area where there was, I mean, I did have a background in the sense my grandmother painted. My mother and father were involved in my mother in the theatre and so on. So they were relaxed about me being in it, in the field. In fact, they encouraged me. But when you get somebody who walks into the room one day and starts to tell us about why Bill Dobell, or William Dobell, who just won the Archibald Prize, and there was a court case, he painted the painter Joshua Smith. And Joshua had a sort of angular look about him, you know. It was unusual in his body structure, and certainly in his facial structure. And Bill had painted him and exaggerated those elements, especially his hands or so. And it was argued in the court case that it was a caricature and not, therefore, a portrait. Anyway, the case was, and Bill Dobell was a very quiet man, and it was just painful, all that stuff. Excuse me, and so Geoffrey walked into the room, I remember this day, into the classroom, and told and explained to us what a portrait was in relation to a photograph, etc., etc., and showed us some of the great portraits of the past, and made the point quite cogently that, you know, a painter is also trying to capture the quality of that person. And as I paint a lot of portraits, and as I look at you, I can see a certain movement in the way you sit, and the way you put your head forward. And you try and pick that out, and the way you softly smile and don't open mouth. and all those sorts of things. I remember saying this to Peter Doherty when I painted him, that, you know, Peter Doherty, the great scientist, and the John Curtin School of Medical Research, excuse me, they wanted me to paint his portrait for the, etc., for the, you know, because he'd won the Nobel Prize. And I remember saying to Peter, Peter, you always have your mouth open. And he said, yes, Brian, I have to breathe. And I said, well, yes, of course, but I'm just, you know. I said, so I'll paint you as the laughing cavalier of Melbourne. He said, well, you know, don't do that too much. Anyway, I jokingly said, he said, I got smashed, my nose was smashed at rugby. You mustn't put this, I shouldn't tell this. No, my nose was smashed at rugby, and you know, and he said, you know, it's hard to breathe through it. So anyway, so I painted him with his mouth slightly open. So I'm just making the point that Geoffrey was able to put across to that class, and myself in particular, what a portrait meant other than just a photograph, just a likeness. What it meant. It was fascinating, just fascinating. And that was the talent he had. And you've met him, and he's a great storyteller. He's got an immaculate memory, an immaculate memory. And the other thing that I learnt from him was, got picked up from him, well, I was a great lover of poetry. Always read poetry as a child. And I was the only kid in the class who liked poetry. When they said, the teacher said, put up your hand if you like poetry, mine was the only hand that went up. Boom. So, but I got onto, at that time, the early experimental poets like T.S. Eliot and so on. And Geoffrey, he used to be able to recite just the stuff, you know, loads of it. Amazing. I mean, it was amazing memory. I never had that talent. But so he introduced me to the history of art, to the actual painting, the way to paint, etc. And it was fascinating. I remember him saying to me once when we went back after school one night, and one of the kids didn't turn up for doing the drawing, and he said, we're going to paint a still life. And he found an object, a knife and a book and something else, and he put it on the chair. He said, you can paint anything for a still life, Brian. It doesn't matter what the subject is, it's important that you were able to turn that into a painting. And that's what you're making. You're making a painting, you're not copying that. And, you know, I remember doing that still life, and I don't have it still, but I don't think I quite finished it. But because, anyway, it was just the way he was able to impart to me the essence of what a good painting was. It was something that came from the soul, and he was able to get that across. A friend of mine from Adelaide, well, my closest friend, became a close friend of Geoffrey, and a young artist too, Clary Dawson. He came to the high school too, and he used to go out painting with we both went out painting with Geoffrey, but Clary would paint, and but I mean, I just, as you know, as you leave high school, you lose touch. But I followed his career, and I kept in touch with him for a couple of years afterwards, and because we would go to the same class. There was a life drawing class held in the Royal South Australian Society of Arts on a Saturday, by Lizette Colehagen, one of the Adelaide painters, women painters, and Geoffrey got me to go, well, encouraged me to go to that. Well, he actually took me to it. So I kept in touch. He was generous in his time that he would give to people, young artists, in particular me, and others. And he was just naturally generous. And he was forthcoming in helping, that is, particular help. And he took me out, we went out painting with him a few times. I made myself a paint box so I could go out into the landscape. And I remember painting with him on Rundle Street, down the east end of Rundle Street. It was pretty dilapidated in those days. Very few cars, very few people actually. And, you know, it was mostly veranda posts, I always remember. There's a painting of mine in the book from that period, of that time. And I remember he was always quite amusing, because he said, you know, he was painting there on the footpath, which is not as wide as this room. Adelaide footpaths are quite wide. And he sat me behind him, and he said, well, you watch me how I do it, but don't copy me. And I said, no, I won't do that. So I was painting away, and we were looking down at the street, you know, along the street. That's what we were both painting. Seemed obvious to me. And people would come up and they'd look at it, you know, and stand there and say, what's he painting? And then somebody said to him, what are you painting? And Geoffrey looked at him, he looked up, and then he turned across and said, those shops over there. And they all looked up and they said, oh yes, oh yes. Nearly fell over when he did that. He was so, that was his instant, quick twist onto anything. He could always come back with a quip. Very amusing, a very amusing man. And so that was, that confidence emanated, it seemed to me, from a tremendously natural love of art, of good painting, should I say. Just an absolute natural love. And and that from that he developed his reading, because that's the one thing that you had to do in Seidel. It was the only thing we had to live on were reproductions. Most of them in those days were black and white. It wasn't until many years later that we got coloured things. That's why that large book that he had from America, which was all colour, was just fascinating. But he was a big reader. I remember one book he had, which I picked up a copy of, called Van Loon's Lives. And that was the Hendrik Van Loon, who did illustrations, and he wrote about artists, where he would bring them, philosophers, artists, politicians, all sorts of people, musicians, poets, writers, should I say, and he would bring them, you know, odd people to dinner, and he would describe this in the book. So that was a fascinating history book for me. I remember him reading that. So, you know, like all of us in Adelaide, we had to learn from books, and we had to learn from reproductions. But it wasn't until Rupert Murdoch's father, I think it was Keith Murdoch, wasn't it? He brought out the modern French painting exhibition. I think it came out during the war, but I saw it after the Second World War in the South Australian Art Gallery, and that's the first time the painters of Paris were seen in Adelaide, and so I saw Derain and Gauguin and Cezanne. And I was fascinated with Bonnard. But I went 3 or 4 times to that show because it was free in those days, no such thing as you have to pay nowadays. There was no blockbuster thing. There was hardly anybody around. So that was an eye opener. But that was just, I mean, we lived for that sort of thing. We were isolated, completely isolated. And as I say, the only way you could really learn from history was to read. He'd got to know the Haywoods, who were collectors of modern British art mostly, but they had a nice little Gauguin, and it was a couple of beautiful Stanley Spencers. I can't remember the others. I saw their collection years later, but Geoffrey got to know the Haywoods. He owned John Martin's store, which became David Jones. But they had a gallery, and he exhibited in that gallery. They had an art gallery, a commercial art gallery. Otherwise, we were restricted to exhibit in the Royal South Australian Society of Arts, and even the Contemporary Art Society used to hire the Royal South Australian Society of Arts for its pictures. And that's the first time I saw Arthur Boyd's and Sid Nolan's work in one of those contemporary art shows. But that would have been before the 50s. I think that was well before. But but yes, well, Jeff and I didn't pick up until many years later when I went to America, and he came back, and he was living in Sydney, and I saw him there. We kept in touch. It was impossible for me not to keep in touch. I revered him so much. I mean, you know, he changed my life for the best, for the better. Well, sometimes I sort of think, I wanted to be an architect, but there was no way in those days. You couldn't my parents couldn't afford that, and there was no such thing as a scholarship. Well, I won a scholarship to go to Adelaide Uni, but not just to pay. I think to pay for your lunch almost. It was nothing, no big deal. The art school had a few people who were really deeply interested. Joseph Choate was a sculptor who taught at St Peter's College. He taught in the sculpture department, and he was exciting, and he was knowledgeable, and he imparted interesting things to you about the traditions and the ideas and the concepts of painting overseas, which of course we all aspired to paint overseas. That was the only thing you really could relate to. And there was the Studio magazine. That was the only way you got information on a regular basis about what was happening in London in particular, and Paris, and sometimes, and that's about it. Nothing about Italy. And it was only through major quality art books, as I said, that Masterpieces of World Art, which came out, I think it might have been brought out by the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So you were isolated. The only thing you weren't isolated from was, in a sense, the theatre, because the plays that were written overseas, they would be performed in Adelaide, albeit with mostly amateur people. But I mean, I painted, I did the sets for I Am a Camera, which was the basis for Cabaret, which was Christopher Isherwood's play, and you know, based on Goodbye to Berlin, the novel. And so that was exciting insofar as what you did, you know, what was happening there. But in the visual arts, you had to rely on a major visiting exhibition before you got a concept of the whole thing and detailed. But as for you know, the fact is that there couldn't be a Piero della Francesca seen in Adelaide because they're painted on walls, they're frescoes. And so I think it was Andre Malraux who spoke of the art book as the museum without walls, which in a sense was another way of saying that you saw the pictures out of context. You didn't see them in situ, and you didn't see them in scale. Everything was that size. And you know, so it was and to this day I only buy art books where they actually tell you the size of the painting, so that I can immediately relate that and think the brushstroke there would be that thick. You know, a little tiny line there, but now it'll be as thick as my thumb. And you know, in other words, I can relate. And it took me a long while to do that, but I think essentially for that period from 1942 through to around about 1946 and 47, 48 when we were at art school, and we both went to Ivor Hill's drawing class, and that was dynamic. So, and then he just went his way. He was exhibiting. He exhibited at the John Martin's Art Gallery at that time, I think about 1950, maybe 51, just before he went away. Mostly watercolours. And he also, he painted, he went up to Kapunda. The copper mines in South Australia were quite famous, and they built these 3- and 4-storey, what they called pumping stations. And they're classic buildings. And I painted a couple with Jeff Wilson up in Burra Burra, but Jeffrey painted one at Kapunda, and the mines were all the slag around, and he put some figures in it. It's a superbly constructed picture with very, very strong colours, and with the traditional, with the unique Jeffrey highlighted wall and darkened wall, and the well, I always thought they were slightly menacing dark clouds and dark skies, which he used a lot, but that was to highlight the buildings in the front and the figures and so on. I'm not sure precisely why he went to Italy, but I think the thing was that it certainly was the centre of of the traditions of the Renaissance, and that, you know, the Renaissance lasted, well, continued right up until, you know, a couple of 100 years ago, and Italian art faded, and the French, as it were, took over with modernism. But I think partly it was because of cost of living. I mean, yes, it was so cheap to live in Italy at that time. And Justin O'Brien had gone there after the war, and they were great friends, he and Jeffrey. And so he lived in Rome, Justin. So I think Geoffrey had had contacts, and but he was also obviously interested in Italian art, the grand painters like Ghirlandaio, whom he always says, you know, which is some of the most amazing paintings in Florence. But I think it seemed to me, mind you, I lost touch for many years, so when I did eventually pick up again, he seemed to be, you know, captivated by the way Piero could interpret the mood, the situation, the mood of figures, and the composition of the figures, and the clarity of the colour, but most importantly, the design. You take a rectangle, right? You take one side of the rectangle, swing it down, and that would create, in other words, you created a square within the rectangle, and when you took that square, you brought that line down. That was roughly the mean. In other words, if you put an object right in the center of the picture, you could dominate the picture, and you could also divide it in half. So you had to be careful that, that is, if you wanted something to be absolutely spot on and everybody to see that immediately, put it right in the middle. But on the other hand, if you still want it to be seen but not dominating, it's a good idea to put it slightly to the left or to the right, which is roughly on that golden mean, as we call it, as the Italians called it. A picture is, after all, a mixture of shapes, coloured shapes. Now, it may be that you're drawing a figure, but you need to place that so that it works within the picture, within the frame, and you need to put the objects associated with it in such a way that they balance. And that's what he was searching, what I see him as searching for. That those underground things, as you say, and the street signs and so on, they're beautifully conceptualized in a flat sense. In other words, you take the thing you're working with is a flat piece of canvas, initially a flat piece of paper, in which you are starting to plan where that line goes, where that line goes, and where that line goes, and then you move them around, you rub that one out, and you move it across, and it works there. Then you put a figure in over here, and then you suddenly realize that line's not working, so you move that across a bit. But you don't do it mathematically. You do it, well, I don't, and I don't imagine that anybody does, because you just trust your eye, to use a phrase. And so Geoffrey had this innate sense of, a learned sense of balancing, and he learnt a lot of that from those people, because the Italian Renaissance was very much, in that 14th, 15th century, very much concerned with the mathematical construct of perspective. And so the idea of the diminishing line, and so that was the important thing that was a major thing for the Italians, because up to that point everything was full front on. There was no depth, well, virtually no depth. And sometimes there was a landscape background. But you could see it in Leonardo's portraits of Mona Lisa, where he's used the background and just flowed it in of hills and so on, you know, just filling it in. But somehow or other it goes back. So he's put bigger hills, smaller hills, smaller hills. So that was part of the uniqueness of the Renaissance. But Piero della Francesca, he utilised the linear perspective quite cleverly, with objects in the front and the figures building around those objects, but the sense of depth he created quite cleverly. But he also composed so that, you know, you looked at the picture, you could see every figure in it, and you could see the subject matter was clear. And that's the way he's been able to do that with his own paintings. There's, you know, that marvellous self-portrait he did, standing up with a, you know, terrific self-portrait, where he's put down the side some a sort of shape about that big, and then there's the portrait of him standing with a cast shadow behind, quite dark. And then on the left there are these boxes, old drinks boxes, with all the labels and colours on them. So beautifully balanced. So, but that would have been planned, you know. He would have moved that across. I mean, we all do it. There's lots of tricks. I've got a problem at home at the moment. I'm not sure where to put this bloody this jar. So I've made a cutout of it and I stuck it on and then I moved it around. Still haven't got it right. I'm going home, and when I go home, I'll see if I suddenly look at it and think, I know where to put that. So that's, you know, we do that a lot. He knew how to put paint on. He knew how to draw. What he grew into is an accomplished major painter. As he evolved, like all of us, he just knew exactly what he would underpaint and overpaint with. I remember talking to you once about using acrylics, because I'd been to the States as a student, and that's when the acrylics first came in the 60s. I mean, you could use them as a water paint, or you could use them as in other words, you could use them in pasto and thick painting and so on. But I mentioned to him that they simulated what used to be egg tempera, that is the underpainting, or what the Italians call the imprimatura, the undercolour, which used in those days be, and still is to a degree, either Venetian red or red ochre, as we might call it, and terre verte or green earth, which are earth colours. They stain the canvas so that you don't paint on pure white canvas. The Impressionists did, of course, but up to that time, and I think Geoffrey still uses it by putting an undercolour on first. And so I remember saying to him, you could do that with acrylic, Geoffrey. Very hesitant. You could do that with acrylic. And could you? I said, yes. Well, you sure you can? I said, yes, it's quite sound. It's been around for 50 years, or 30, 40 years, and so it's the modern version of egg tempera. It's just as, the only difference is the medium, not the colour. So I think he did use that, I think, but I'm not sure how much he used it. But I remember talking to him about that. So he was extremely interested in all the technical elements of painting. And don't forget, he had a very good friend in Justin O'Brien, who was trained by a classical painter in Sydney, a muralist who painted in churches, and he was his assistant. So he would have known about a lot of those technicalities, and presumably they chatted about them more casually at times over a coffee, I imagine. The Kapunda mines in particular I cite as a good example, that he would use this quite strong contrast, which of course surrealism was voguish, and he picked up on that, and it obviously intrigued him, and it did me, but I wasn't game enough to do what he did. So he was always experimental, but my perception is that he just evolved, but he formed very much the direction he was going before he went to Europe. It seemed to me he had clearly, he was fairly clear on his interests and his direction. It always was that he would compose beautifully and cleverly, and he would paint realistically, not photographically, but he would paint the object. He wasn't going to get into the gestural of Arthur Boyd or and the symbolic thing of Sid Nolan and all that sort of new art, which was modernism in Australia. He didn't seem to me to want to get into that. He always was taking the object and devising the composition, planning it, little sketches, etc., moving things around until he got it composed, and applying his paint with a great deal of sensitivity, as distinct from gesture. But I'm sure he did sketches at times and did them very freely, but when it came to the actual final picture, it was that. And so I surmise that when he got to Italy and started to see these wonderful paintings, well, I can only surmise this because I had the same experience. When I first got to Italy, I was absolutely blown apart by seeing these major works, large works, which I'd only seen in illustrations. So these major works, beautifully painted, beautifully drawn, and the colour, because they didn't have a lot of colours in those days, like we nowadays have. So the colours were very contrasting, but they were never glaring. So it was always an earth colour or near to an earth colour. I think there was only lapis lazuli, which was blue, and that was extremely expensive. So you saw that in a Vermeer painting, but they're only that big anyway. I think it's just, that reminds me, you know, I mean, he would have seen Vermeer, I imagine, when he first went to Europe and France and Paris. I don't know that he travelled to Holland. I don't know that, but he would have seen in the Louvre these classical paintings and the way they applied paint. I mean, you can look at paintings of Jacques-Louis David in the Louvre, and it's quite surprisingly quite thinly painted. You can see the brushstrokes; they're not impastoed, they're not thick. I don't know that Geoffrey ever painted really thick. It's just, sufficient colour to give it depth, and that was it. But mostly it was beautifully conceptualized, a clear image. But you can have a clear image, but to, put it together. In the early days, like all of us, in Adelaide at that time, as I said, the only way you could get really interesting stuff from Europe, it was the theatre. As I cited with the Christopher Isherwood, I Am a Camera was called, which is a silly title, but that was the title. It was mostly to do with Sally Bowles and Goodbye to Berlin. And then subsequently, as I said to you, it was transposed into the musical Cabaret. Now, he would be asked to do sets, like all of us young artists, for the various amateur groups, which you'd design the set and you'd paint the thing. So that's essentially what they wanted, somebody who could handle some paint in some large areas. And so he asked me to come along and help him paint some sets once, and that's how I got involved. So you see, he introduced me to so much in my creative life. Just introduced me to them. He was just a very inspiring, naturally inspiring teacher. But I make the point very definitely. He was most generous in his time and his consideration. I recall as an example of when a very good friend of mine, Geoffrey Wilson, who's one of Adelaide's best artists, he still exhibits, and we were exactly the same age. And Geoffrey, in his early days, when we were at high school, would go out and do watercolour painting and so on. And Geoffrey Wilson told me yesterday on the phone, he said, I recall when Geoffrey Smart saw some of these drawings and sought me out and found out where I was, where he could contact me. And then he said to me, you've got to look, he told Geoffrey Smart told Geoffrey Wilson, he said, you've got to look at these books. And he listed the books, and he said, you'll find them in the library on North Terrace, the State Library. And I said, I know where they are, Jeff Wilson. I said yesterday on the phone, I said, I know where they are because Geoffrey used to take me there and show me the books where I'd find the particular books that I could borrow. You couldn't take those books out of the library at the time. You could only see them in there. And I think the library's still there, but of course it's been added to, but the original place. So, that's just a little example, a small example of him taking an interest in trying to help a young artist who needed that sort of assistance or well, help. And but he went out of his way to do that. I think that's innate with him. It seemed to me innate, because that's what he did for me. And I saw him do it with Clary Dawson, my school friend, who went on painting but never became a professional. He died recently, but he never sort of had the confidence, it would seem to me, to actually exhibit, which, you're exposing a little bit of your soul when you do that. Well, Leonardo was working with Verrocchio, I think was the workshop he worked in. Yes, it was, Verrocchio. So they would have learnt, or there would have been about 20 or 30 technicians and people working in there, people who prepared the canvas, prepared the boards, no canvas, but prepared the boards and so on. Now, there was a painter there called Baldo Venetti, who was the expert, so to speak, on artist materials. And those times there was this transition from using egg tempera through to using oil, and there were various oils. And there was poppy oil, slow drying, but only linseed oil did they find later that was the fastest drying, which only dries on the surface in about 24 hours, but the others will take days. And that's why egg tempera was so good, because it was instant. But there was also in Italy coal tar oil, because there's tons of tar in oil, tar in Italy. That's hence the Roman roads used this tar. So Leonardo used coal tar oil. So it is suspected on the Mona Lisa, and it's gradually gone dark. Now, 400 years, it's inevitable that the coal tar oil would gradually come up the surface and start to, as it were, mix with the what's called pentimento. It would come up through and mix with the actual pigment, which were powder pigments. So that's why it's gone dark. And they've discovered an almost identical painting of the Mona Lisa by a female in the crypts of the Prado, and I saw a real illustration of it. There it is in full colour, and because it's been in the dark, and maybe not with coal tar oil, but she apparently was working with Leonardo whilst he was doing that painting, and that's probably get it on the internet, but. So you could see there the quality of the colour. So that points up what I'm saying about the disappointment of the Mona Lisa, because I took my grandson there recently. He's a very talented young actor, but he's also quite a good painter. And he came back to me and he said, "Oh, that's a bit of a letdown." I was amused, because he's not the first person who said that to me. But those urban pictures of roads and things, they emanated. Well, the first one I saw was the Carl Expressway, which was the first, excuse me, that's the first time I saw that urbanisation. But that's reasonable, because I wasn't living in Sydney where he was painting and exhibiting. So it must have happened then. So that would have been before he went to Italy permanently. I think he was in Sydney for about 8 years, 8 or 9 or 10 years, so 51 to 61. Well, he must have been there in 62, 61, because that's when I saw him again, when on my way to study to work in America and study. So I'd got a Fulbright and I had to go by, anyway, I was going over and I wanted to do art history, and I found some people at a university where they had the best quality, as I understood it with my research, of Renaissance art historians. So I wanted specifically to work with them, which I did. The particular professor was called Wallace Tomasini, but so he was there in Sydney in 61. So he must have gone to Italy permanently after that.
I think it was
and I think it was a bit. What happened, I think, was his father passed away, and left him a little bit of money, and he was able to put deposits on a couple of houses in Willara or Paddington, and he was living off the rent. Now you could do that in Italy, but things were tough because people didn't necessarily pay their rent, did they? So you know, it was hard going for him, but he never quibbled. He never quibbled, and he was never a tight ass. He was always generous. You know, you just felt that he was never. But I knew that, like all of us, you're always on the edge in those days. There's no guarantee you're going to sell at the next exhibition, you know. I learned that, though, early on, because I had a couple of good shows and sold a lot, and I put the money away, so I was able to get through a couple of shows that didn't come off. But and he was fairly astute with his money, so I imagine he did the same thing. But it was not easy any time, and it was in the last 20 years, I think, it's, you know, suddenly it took off. Well, I'll take a personal example. I found that suddenly I'm getting this prize. The last show in Sydney, the dealers put $32,000 on one of my paintings. Oh, I said, pushing it a bit, aren't you? They said, we'll see, it's a good painting. Anyway, it sold. And it sold to a German collector. So, you know, it just suddenly, here I am in my, you know, early 80s. Well, I've just turned 80 when that happened. And but I'd sold quite well up to that, but never that sort of price. I'd sold prices for 12,000, 15, 20, 15,000 at the most or something. But when it's suddenly 32, I thought, crazy. Well, I actually started with 40,000. I said, forget it.